Welcome, weary soul. Tonight, I am your narrator, poised to guide you into a state of profound and tranquil slumber. Before we commence, please remember to engage with the video by liking it and subscribing for an array of additional bedtime narratives. Feel free to share in the comments your current viewing location and the prevailing time. Should there be a particular tale you wish to hear recounted in the future, I would be delighted to know. Story 1. The Deadly Secret at Copperleaf Retreat. Every time someone mentions Alaska, my stomach twists into knots. People invariably picture the stunning wilderness and magnificent northern lights, but all the narrator can recall is that terrifying night at Copperleaf Retreat. At the time, the narrator was fresh out of her junior year at college, having secured a seasonal job as a front desk clerk and maintenance helper at this tiny, remote lodge located near Wrangell St. Elias National Park. It was June 2022, and the lodge was essentially her entire world for 3 months. The retreat comprised 12 small cabins scattered across the property, interconnected by gravel paths that audibly crunched underfoot, no matter how quietly one attempted to walk. Their nearest neighbor was 40 miles away, and cell service was absolutely non-existent. The sole connection to the outside world was a single landline in the main office that crackled with static on good days. Most nights, the silence was so profound it felt as though they were the only people left on Earth. The guests that week were primarily hikers and photographers, the kind of individuals who specifically traveled to Alaska to escape civilization. There was a particular couple, David and Amanda, who had been staying in Cabin 7 for 3 days with their friend Troy. David was one of those gregarious individuals who never seemed to stop talking, perpetually cracking jokes and eliciting laughter during meals in the main lodge. Amanda was quieter, more reserved, but she possessed a keen observational quality, constantly taking mental notes of everything around her. Troy fell somewhere in between, friendly enough, but largely kept to himself. They would spend their days hiking the trails around the property and return every evening completely exhausted, covered in mud and mosquito bites. The dynamic between them appeared normal enough, just 3 friends on a wilderness adventure. But there was an underlying tension the narrator couldn't quite pinpoint, particularly between David and Troy. The day everything went wrong began like any other. The narrator had spent most of it repairing a broken water heater in Cabin 3 and restocking supplies in the main lodge. The weather had been unusually warm for June, and by evening the air was thick with mosquitoes and that strange twilight that never fully transitions into complete darkness during Alaskan summers. Around 9 p.m., the narrator observed David, Amanda, and Troy heading toward the bathhouse, a small wooden building approximately 100 yards from the main lodge. Troy was carrying a towel and seemed eager to finally get cleaned up after their long hike. David and Amanda were walking behind him, and the narrator could hear David's voice growing louder as they moved further away, although she couldn't discern what he was saying. There was something about his tone that caused the narrator to pause while locking up the office, but she shrugged it off. Guests sometimes argued, especially when fatigued and coping with the isolation. About an hour later, the narrator was in her small staff cabin reading when she heard voices outside. At first, she thought it was just other guests returning from evening activities, but the voices were growing closer and more agitated. Then she heard Amanda's voice, sharp and panicked, calling out something about Troy being missing. The narrator put down her book and listened more carefully. David was with Amanda, and they were moving from cabin to cabin, knocking on doors and inquiring if anyone had seen Troy. Their voices carried a frantic edge that caused the hair on the narrator's arms to stand up. The narrator grabbed her flashlight and stepped outside, and that's when Amanda spotted her. Amanda came running over, her face pale even in the dim light, with David right behind her. a wild look in his eyes the narrator had never witnessed before. Amanda repeatedly stated that Troy had disappeared after some kind of fight near the bathhouse, but when the narrator pressed for details, both of them seemed to stumble over their words. The story they told her kept changing every time she asked a question. First, Amanda claimed Troy had gotten into an argument with a stranger who was lurking around the bathhouse. Then David interjected, saying the stranger had been there for hours, simply observing people come and go. But when the narrator inquired about the stranger's appearance, Amanda described a tall man with dark hair, while David insisted he was shorter with a beard. Their descriptions were so disparate, it was as if they were discussing completely different people. Amanda continuously wrung her hands and nervously looked around while David paced back and forth, repeatedly running his fingers through his hair. The entire situation felt wrong, as if they were performing some rehearsed panic rather than genuinely worrying about their friend. The narrator suggested they check the bathhouse first, thinking perhaps Troy had simply wandered off to cool down after whatever argument had occurred. But as they walked toward the building, the narrator noticed David kept glancing at Amanda with quick, meaningful looks that made her skin crawl. The bathhouse was completely empty when they arrived, but there were clear signs of some kind of struggle. The wooden bench outside was overturned, and there were scuff marks in the dirt that suggested someone had been dragged or had fallen hard. Amanda immediately began crying, stating they needed to call the police. But when the narrator suggested using the landline in the main office, David quickly insisted they should search the property first. He maintained that Troy had probably just gone for a walk to clear his head and would be back any minute. However, the forced calm in his voice made the narrator realize he was attempting to control the situation. The narrator agreed to help them search, but she was already planning to contact the authorities as soon as they returned to the lodge. The three of them spent the next hour combing through the trails with flashlights, calling Troy's name and receiving no response. Every shadow seemed threatening and every sound made them jump. Amanda repeatedly asked what they were going to do, but David consistently steered the conversation away from seeking external help. When they finally abandoned the search around midnight, the narrator was exhausted and genuinely worried about Troy. She informed David and Amanda that she was going to call the state troopers from the main office, and that's when David's entire demeanor drastically shifted. He grabbed the narrator's arm and stated they should wait until morning, that Troy would probably show up on his own, and they would simply be wasting everyone's time. But Amanda disagreed, asserting they needed to call Troy's family and inform them about the situation. The two of them began arguing right there in front of the narrator, and she could hear the desperation in both their voices. David continuously insisted that contacting the police would only worsen matters, while Amanda was practically begging him to allow the narrator to make the call. During their argument, the narrator noticed David had scratches on his forearms that were definitively not present earlier in the day, and when she questioned him about them, he claimed he had sustained them while pushing through some bushes during their search. But the scratches looked fresh and deep, like fingernail marks, and they were in a pattern that made the narrator suspect someone had been trying to defend themselves. The narrator finally convinced them that they needed to contact the authorities, and the three of them walked back to the main lodge together. The building felt eerily quiet as the narrator unlocked the office door, and she could hear both David and Amanda breathing heavily behind her. When the narrator picked up the landline phone to dial, there was no dial tone, just complete silence. She jiggled the cord and checked all the connections, but the line was completely dead. David immediately claimed the phone lines had probably gone down due to the weather, but there hadn't been any storms that day. Amanda grew more agitated by the minute, pacing around the small office and muttering about needing to get help somehow. The narrator told them she would drive to the nearest town in the morning to report Troy missing, but David quickly volunteered to go instead. He asserted He knew the area better and could get there faster, but something about his eagerness to leave made the narrator suspicious. The narrator insisted that they all stay together until they figured out what had happened to Troy, and that's when the narrator noticed David and Amanda exchange another one of those loaded glances. They decided to wait until dawn before making any further decisions, and the narrator offered to let them stay in the main lodge instead of returning to their cabin. Amanda immediately accepted, but David seemed reluctant, stating he wanted to go back and retrieve some of their belongings. The narrator watched him walk toward cabin 7, and something about the way he moved, quick and purposeful, made her decide to follow him at a discreet distance. She grabbed her flashlight and snuck out the back door of the lodge, remaining in the shadows as she made her way toward their cabin. David remained inside for perhaps 10 minutes, and when he emerged, he was carrying a large duffel bag that appeared significantly heavier than it should have if he was merely getting clothes. He also had something wrapped in a towel tucked under his arm, and he kept looking around nervously as he walked back. The narrator managed to return to the lodge before him, but she pretended to be dozing in one of the lobby chairs when he returned. Amanda was curled up on the couch, but the narrator could tell she wasn't truly sleeping either. The three of them spent the remainder of the night in that main room, and the narrator doubted any of them got a minute of genuine sleep. When the sun finally rose around 4:30 a.m., the narrator suggested they all walk back to the bathhouse area in the daylight to see if they could find any more clues about what happened to Troy. David immediately protested, claiming they had already searched thoroughly and wouldn't find anything new. But Amanda stood up and stated she wanted to look again, and after a moment of hesitation, David agreed to accompany them. As they walked toward the bathhouse, the narrator noticed David continuously positioned himself between Amanda and her, as if attempting to control what they could see or where they could go. The morning light revealed details they had missed in the darkness. There were drops of what looked like dried liquid on the wooden steps of the bathhouse, and the ground around the building was more disturbed than the narrator had initially realized. Amanda pointed out a torn piece of fabric caught on a nearby bush, and when she started to reach for it, David quickly stepped in and declared, "We shouldn't touch anything that might be evidence." But the way he said it, with this forced authority in his voice, made the narrator wonder if he was trying to preserve evidence or destroy it. Around 7 a.m., the narrator heard the distant sound of a helicopter approaching, which was unusual given that they rarely experienced air traffic that early in the morning. David's face went completely white when he heard it, and he began talking rapidly about how they should probably head back to their cabin to pack up and leave. But Amanda was staring at the helicopter with an expression of relief mixed with terror, and she whispered something about hoping it was help. The helicopter landed in the clearing near the main lodge, and 2 state troopers exited along with a paramedic. The narrator's first thought was that someone else had called about Troy, but then she realized that was impossible since their phone lines were down. One of the troopers approached them and inquired if they were the individuals who had reported a missing person. And before the narrator could answer, David interjected and claimed there had been a misunderstanding. He asserted Troy had merely wandered off for a walk and had probably already made it back to town on his own. The trooper appeared skeptical and requested to speak with each of them separately, beginning with Amanda. While Amanda was conversing with the officers, David continuously attempted to convince the narrator that they should tell them everything was fine and that Troy would eventually reappear. David was sweating despite the cool morning air, and he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. But then the paramedic approached and informed them they had found Troy approximately 2 miles downstream near the old mining road. He was alive, but in critical condition with multiple stab wounds, and they had already airlifted him to a hospital in Fairbanks. The paramedic explained that Troy had managed to crawl to the road and flagged down a passing truck driver who had called for help on his CB radio. When the narrator looked at David after hearing this news, his face had gone completely gray, and he was staring at the ground as if attempting to disappear. Amanda started crying, but they were not tears of relief. They were tears of palpable fear. The troopers arrested David that afternoon after finding the knife wrapped in the towel he had retrieved from their cabin, and Amanda confessed that she had helped him move Troy's body after the attack. She stated that David had snapped during an argument about money Troy owed him, and they had panicked when they thought he was dead. The phone line had been deliberately cut with wire cutters found in David's bag. Amanda received a reduced sentence for cooperating, but David was charged with attempted murder. The narrator quit her job the next day and never returned to Alaska. Sometimes she still wakes up wondering what would have happened if that truck driver hadn't found Troy in time. Story 2. The Unseen Hunter by the Kuskokwim. Most summers, my Uncle Tim would take me out fishing somewhere truly remote in Alaska. He's the kind of man who believes Wi-Fi is a government deception and that authentic life commences when your boots sink into mud. That particular trip, they were camped just outside Bethel, along a bend in the Kuskokwim River, where the bank sloped down in a jagged array of roots and compacted silt. The narrator had just turned 13 that spring, and it was his first time acquiring his own fishing gear, a rod, boots, even a small fillet knife. He recalled feeling immense pride, as if he had finally earned a place alongside the grown-ups, even if he still had to sleep in the smaller tent. It was early afternoon, and Tim had hiked upriver a considerable distance to check some traps, leaving the narrator with instructions not to wander far and to maintain the fire. The sun was out, but hazy, filtered through low clouds that rendered everything softer, quieter. The narrator had settled by the water with his tackle box and a half-warmed thermos of black coffee he wasn't really supposed to be consuming. The current was slow that day, dragging bits of moss and drift in wide arcs, and the narrator remembered watching the surface as if it were a film. No phone, no distractions, just that steady hush of water and wind. Then someone called out from the trees behind him. At first, the narrator thought it was Tim teasing him. The voice possessed that friendly yet strange tone, like someone carefully trying not to startle a stray dog. When the narrator turned, he saw a man standing halfway down the slope leading into the brush. He was wearing a camouflage jacket that looked as if it had been dipped in mud and forgotten for years, and a wool beanie stretched over his head as though he had pulled it on without checking if it fit properly. The narrator did not recognize him. He wasn't from the campgrounds or from the small shop they had stopped at in town. The man smiled with his mouth open just enough to reveal a missing canine tooth and stated he was a local guide. He claimed he was transporting gear for a group of hunters and required a second pair of hands. There was something about how impossibly still he stood while talking that did not feel right to the narrator. His feet never shifted, and his hands remained clasped behind his back, even when he gestured with his chin toward the trees. The narrator inquired which outfitter he worked for, and he dodged the question as if the narrator had asked for his social security number. Then he laughed, a dry, shallow sound, and muttered that the narrator looked strong enough to carry a couple of crates. He pointed deeper into the woods, asserting it wasn't far, just past a ridge. The narrator remembered feeling his knees tense, not precisely with fear, but as if his body had already made a decision before his brain had consciously caught up. The narrator told him he needed to retrieve his boots, a stalling tactic, but the man stepped forward as if he hadn't heard him. Only a few feet, but it felt excessively close. His boots sank into the soft dirt near the water's edge, leaving deep, wide prints as though he had been pacing that shoreline for a considerable period. That's when the narrator noticed the back of his pants were soaked up to the thighs, and not from walking through shallow river water. It was darker, muddier, as if he had been kneeling somewhere wet for too long. He glanced toward the trail again, but there wasn't any gear in sight. Just thick brush and a mess of alder branches snapped low, as if someone had pushed through them quickly and recently. The narrator said no. He didn't even think about it. He just uttered it aloud, firm and clear, the way his uncle had instructed him to speak if something ever felt wrong. The man did not respond immediately. He just kept standing there, staring, as if the narrator hadn't spoken at all. His face remained expressionless, but his jaw clenched once quickly. Then he sort of laughed through his nose and muttered something under his breath that sounded like, "They never learn." That's when the narrator backed away, careful not to turn around, keeping the river behind him as a protective barrier. He felt a strange pressure, as if he had to keep talking or moving or doing something, because silence felt inherently dangerous. The narrator walked backward until he encountered a log that marked the trail back to camp. That's when the man took one more step toward him, slow and deliberate, and stated, "You don't want to be out here alone when it gets dark." It wasn't a direct threat, not exactly, but rather like he was stating a simple fact. His tone was flat and strangely calm, as if he were merely reciting a weather report. The narrator didn't answer. He just turned and ran. He didn't check if the man followed, and he didn't hear footsteps, but he also did not trust the pervasive quiet. The trees seemed thicker on the way back, as if they were leaning in, and the narrator remembered ducking under branches that had not been low before. By the time he reached the tents, he couldn't tell if he'd been gone for 10 minutes or an hour. Everything looked the same, but it all felt off balance, as if the world had been nudged slightly sideways. The narrator did not see Tim anywhere, and for a second he panicked, fearing that man had perhaps gotten to his uncle too. But then he saw smoke curling up from the fire pit. Tim emerged from behind the truck a few seconds later, holding a wrench, wiping grease off his fingers. He inquired if the narrator had caught anything. The narrator told him no, and that they needed to pack up early. Tim gave him a questioning look but did not argue. They departed that same afternoon. Tim did not press for details until they were halfway down the gravel road, returning toward town. The narrator recounted what had happened as straightforwardly as he could. Tim became very quiet, not angry, just focused, as if he was already mentally reviewing maps and faces. He asked what the man looked like, what he had said, and if the narrator could pinpoint the exact spot. The narrator told him about the soaked pants, the missing tooth, and the part where the man kept his hands out of view. Tim did not speak for a while after that. When they arrived in town, he made a quick stop at the local authorities' outpost, while the narrator waited in the truck with the windows cracked and his fishing rod still in the back seat, untouched. That night, back at the motel, the news was playing in the background while they were eating. The narrator was barely paying attention until Tim turned up the volume. A missing persons alert had been issued for a boy named Alex, 15 years old. Last seen just outside a different campsite, not far from theirs, 4 days earlier. There were no solid leads, but the report mentioned he was last spotted talking to someone described as a man in camouflage, possibly local. The photograph of the missing kid deeply affected the narrator. He was taller than the narrator, but something about his expression felt familiar. Just a regular teen trying to enjoy the outdoors, who probably did not anticipate his afternoon to take such a dark turn. The narrator did not sleep much that night. He kept thinking about how quickly things could have gone bad if he had said yes, if he had followed, if he had hesitated even a second longer. He knew he didn't do anything heroic. He just listened to that part of himself that tenses up when something feels fundamentally wrong. He still thinks about that man's voice sometimes, how calm it was when he told the narrator he didn't want to be alone out there, not angry, not frustrated, just certain, as if he wasn't guessing how things would conclude. He already knew. They haven't returned to that spot since. Tim said they'd stick to places closer to town for a while. The narrator never saw the man again, and as far as he knows, no one was ever arrested. The other boy, Alex, was never found. His name occasionally appears in forums like this, and every time it does, the narrator contemplates saying something, reporting the interaction again. But the truth is, he has already said what he knows, and perhaps posting here now is simply a way to remind anyone reading. Trust that gut feeling, even if it doesn't make logical sense in the moment, especially when it doesn't. Story 3. The Relentless Pursuer on the Highway. I still don't understand why I didn't turn around that day. Part of me believes it was just denial. I didn't want to admit something was terribly wrong. We were supposed to be traveling to a wrestling tournament in Satna, just me and my son, Mason. He was 16, deeply involved in sports, always casually tossing his gym bag into the back seat as if he owned the entire world. I had taken the weekend off from my dental practice, packed us both up, filled the gas tank at an Apex fuel station near Kenny Spur Road, and anticipated making good time before sunset. The drive down from our town was familiar. We had done it twice before for other school events. I recall telling myself it would be a tranquil ride, perhaps even an opportunity for us to converse without distractions. We were about 30 minutes south of Sterling when I noticed the pickup truck. It had dark tinted windows and an older matte gray paint job. Nothing flashy, just enough to blend in. It subtly merged into my lane behind us, somewhere past the last gas station. Initially, I didn't think much of it. The highway is long and mostly empty, and vehicles sometimes stick together for miles. But this one remained unsettlingly close. Too close. I checked the rearview mirror more than once, expecting it to pass, but it never did. I even nudged my car over to the right shoulder, slowing down enough to invite it to go around. Instead, the driver precisely matched my speed, maintaining the same tight distance, almost as if he were tethered to us. I pointed it out to Mason, attempting to conceal my nervousness. He was engrossed in his phone, but glanced up and muttered something like, "creeper vibes." He wasn't wrong. I tested it again. I sped up slightly, then intentionally dropped to below the speed limit. The truck mirrored every maneuver. I tapped the brakes twice, a common tactic my father used to warn tailgaters, but there was no change. I switched lanes for no apparent reason, and it remained steadfastly behind us. It wasn't aggressive, just deliberate. That's what made it worse. There was no honking, no flashing lights, no engine revving, just that constant pressure behind us, as if we were being herded somewhere. I didn't want to panic in front of Mason, but a cold realization began to dawn on me. This wasn't just someone zoning out on the highway. It was too late to turn back, and cell signal was weak in that particular stretch. I instructed Mason to open the Maps app and locate the nearest place to pull over that had lights, perhaps a store or a rest area. We found a rest stop about 10 minutes ahead. It was barely marked on the map, just a faded icon, but it was preferable to remaining in motion with this individual glued to our bumper. I maintained my calm, or at least attempted to. My knuckles were beginning to ache from how tightly I was gripping the steering wheel. The rest stop was not what I had hoped for. It was a gravel pull-off with one flickering street lamp, a rusted vending machine that likely hadn't worked since the early 2000s, and a single unmarked porta-potty tilted slightly in the mud. There were no other cars, no people, just wind moving through the trees and the dull hum of the nearby river. I slowed down and pulled in anyway, thinking if the truck passed us, I would simply wait a few minutes before resuming our journey, but it did not pass. It followed us in, slow, steady, and confidently. I felt Mason sit up straight. I could tell he was trying to appear unfazed, but I observed the way he held his breath. The truck did not park next to us. It angled itself behind my car, effectively cutting off our exit as if it had rehearsed the maneuver. I didn't recognize the model precisely, an older Chevy or GMC, perhaps late 90s, but there was something peculiar about the front grille. It looked homemade, reinforced, as if someone had welded extra bars across it. My headlights reflected off the tinted windshield, but I couldn't see inside. There was no movement, no door opening, just the truck sitting there, engine still running, a low, idle rumbling through the quiet like a distinct warning. I told Mason, "Don't get out," and grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Mason whispered that he was already recording. He had flipped his camera around and angled it low against the dashboard, barely moving his hand. I didn't even have to ask. He just did it. A smart kid. I instructed him to keep filming no matter what. I was about to honk just once, perhaps to scare whoever it was or alert someone nearby, even though I doubted anyone would hear. But before I could, the driver's side door of the truck cracked open, not all the way, just a few inches. Then it shut again. Nothing else. No one got out. I couldn't explain the movement, but it felt calculated, as if they were letting us know they were observing, deciding. That was the moment it ceased feeling like paranoia and began feeling like an undeniable trap. I didn't want to reverse into them, but we were completely boxed in. There was a steep ditch to the right and dense trees on the left. I kept thinking if I drove forward over the grass, I might get stuck. So I just remained there, engine running, doors locked. The truck crept forward an inch, just one, and I couldn't help it. I yelled, "What the hell do you want?" Mason grabbed my arm, attempting to calm me down, and whispered, "Mom, wait." The driver still didn't move, just that engine humming as if it had all the time in the world. Out of pure instinct, I leaned on the horn, long and loud. It echoed across the trees and the empty highway beyond. That finally had an effect. The truck jolted backward, then reversed fast, kicking up gravel behind it. It didn't leave the lot entirely. It stopped again by the exit, halfway turned toward the road, as if the driver couldn't decide whether to flee or wait. I put the car in drive, aimed straight at the ditch, and floored it. The wheels bounced hard over the edge, the undercarriage scraped, but we successfully made it through the muddy patch and onto the far side of the rest stop. I didn't look back until I was on the highway again. When I checked the mirror, the truck was gone. Not on the road behind us, not in the lot, just vanished. Mason stopped recording, and we drove the next 20 minutes in silence until we reached a more populated area and I could finally breathe again. I pulled into a busy grocery store parking lot and made him send the video to my email just in case. We sat there for a while before I called the police. I didn't even care if they thought I was being dramatic. I knew what we had just experienced wasn't normal. It wasn't road rage. It wasn't a prank. It was something darker. The trooper who met us took it seriously. I showed him the footage, and he actually recognized the truck right away. He didn't provide us with the full story, but he stated the driver matched the description of someone they had been trying to locate for months, connected to at least 3 other roadside harassment reports along the Kenai Peninsula. The incidents always occurred late afternoons, always targeting women driving alone or with children. Nothing had escalated to physical violence, but the behavior was escalating. He stated that Mason's video was the clearest evidence they had obtained so far, and that it might finally give them what they needed to make an arrest. We never heard what transpired afterward. They didn't follow up, likely for legal reasons, but I've never driven that stretch of highway again, not without someone in the passenger seat and a full tank of gas. Mason also stopped asking for solo drives. He still jokes that he saved the day with his camera, and perhaps he's right. That little bit of instinct might have prevented us from becoming another case they never solved. I just hope whoever was behind that wheel, whoever thought that kind of thing was a game, realized they picked the wrong car that night.